in 1789 in the French Revolution. In other words, it was easier for us in those days to communicate more comfortably with someone who had been on the June barricades in Paris, workers who had been on the June barricades in Paris under the red flags of 1848, than it would have been to talk to someone today, or even to, contemporaries or people younger, a generation later than my own, or 2 generations later than my own, who were to make up the new left. So that old left that everybody talks about had some very limiting features about it, but it also had enormously expansive features about it. It had a rich musical heritage. It felt it was really completing the French Revolution of 1789 to 1794. And we all modeled ourselves, even the Bolsheviks in Russia modeled ourselves on the French Revolution, the whole cycle of the revolution. We thought in terms of a class struggle of the working class, the proletariat, industrial proletariat, which was very numerous at that point in the United States. In the 1920s, the assembly line had come in. We didn't have that before, not quite in the form that Henry Ford produced. And workers and unions and everything like that, and workers' parties, the word worker, proletarian, was on everybody's lips. So it was a period in which we had a very coherent analysis of the working class taking power, establishing a proletarian dictatorship, which we thought would be more democratic, in fact, than the American Bill of Rights, for example, because now the people would control the press, not the oligarchical few capitalists. And we saw workers in action. They were really doing revolutionary things, so it seemed to us. It's not only that they were going out on strike, it's not only that workers were very deeply class conscious, an amazing phenomenon that people have forgotten about today. Workers knew that they were workers. They called themselves labor. They called themselves workers, and in the most radical cases they called themselves proletarians, and that would not have been alien to most workers in industry, mines, in many cases even craft-type workers. We used to have cigar workers working right out in the open in little cigar stores wrapping leaves of tobacco. We had craftsmen all over. We didn't have, incidentally, the giant supermarkets and the corporate type of retail outlets that we have today. In those days, everything was a mom-and-pop store. And you knew everyone in the neighborhood. We also had open-air meetings, soapbox meetings, as they used to be called, where regularly, almost every day of the week, if the weather was reasonably clement, somebody would be on a stand talking about revolutionary ideas and talking about all kinds of class issues, dealing with class struggle, with socialism, with communism. And unfortunately, at that point, we didn't have very much anarchism around. The anarchist movement had more or less been overshadowed by the communists and the socialists. Remember well that in 1932, in the depths of the Depression, Norman Thomas, the socialist candidate for president, got more votes, almost 1 million votes, than Eugene V. Debs did in 1912, which was regarded as the heyday of American socialism, and that the communists got another 160 or 170,000. So you see, these were big, sizable movements that were very much in the public eye, however small the membership was. And also, finally, in the 1930s, it seemed like everything was going to be fulfilled. All our dreams as Marxists and as revolutionaries were going to be fulfilled. Terrible as the Depression was for so many people in the United States, for us it was something different that had meaning. The Depression, despite the economic deprivation, every one of us felt very personally. And I saw my furniture in the house out on the street every 3 months because of rental evictions, which was a standard routine during the Depression. At times you'd see a whole block covered, the sidewalks covered with the furniture of people who were being evicted from their apartments for non-payment of rent. And I knew what it meant to go hungry, even for several days. The point is that despite this kind of material deprivation that many of us radicals in those days felt, particularly communists and socialists, and I guess anarchists, we still felt exhilarated. In 1934, for example, the Austrian workers broke out in an insurrection. Workers, classical Socialist Party workers in Vienna, raised red flags and fought against the Dollfuss regime, which suppressed their insurrection. You see a touch of that in the movie Julia, when Jane Fonda comes to Vienna, and you see the workers with their hands on their heads and guarded by the steel helmets, as they were called. And then again, you had another insurrection about 8 months later in Spain. I'm not talking of the Spanish Civil War. I'm talking of the uprising of the Asturian coal miners, who held cities like Oviedo for 3 weeks against the Spanish Foreign Legion, one of the most brutal military forces that existed in the world at that time. We felt the upheavals going on in Germany, and we had echoes of Italian anti-fascists who had fought Mussolini and were in exile. And then, of course, came that greatest of all events, one of the greatest in history, in my opinion, one of the very greatest, the Spanish Revolution of 1936, when one of the biggest anarcho-syndicalist movements, the CNT, National Confederation of Labor, with its anarchist adjunct or vanguard, if you like, and they use the word, anarchists use the words vanguard, words like vanguard, the FAI, or the Iberian Anarchist Federation, which altogether probably influenced at least 1 million people out of 24 million. I mean, where do you find an anarcho-syndicalist movement that large with its black and red flag, which has since been emulated in Latin America by the Sandinistas and others? The black standing for anarchy, the red standing for syndicalism, or workers' control of the factories. I mean, they collectivized a huge portion of the Republican area in the northeast of Spain, put it in established workers' control, established workers' committees to take over factories. In fact, the greater part of the factories in Catalonia, the northeastern stronghold of the anarcho-syndicalists, were taken over by the unions. See, and private property, to the extent that it existed, was very carefully controlled. Those inspiring events shaped our outlook so that when the war came, we expected that the Second World War would be a continuation of the First World War. We thought it was just another imperialist war, and we were indoctrinated into believing. By this time, by the way, I had broken with the Stalinists, the Communist Party, and I drifted over to Trotskyism. But we thought at that point, by 1939 and 1940, that the Second World War wouldn't even last as long as the First World War, that it would end as the First World War had in workers' insurrections. In fact, we saw in the darkness of the Second World War the beginning, we thought, of the glow of a new society. This would be it, the end of capitalism. Capitalism had gone through its chronic crisis of the 1930s, as Marx had predicted, and now, steeled with the more advanced ideas than even existed before the First World War, no longer social democrats, but one or another form of Bolshevism, committed to one or another form of Bolshevism, in this case Trotskyism, that the war would end very shortly in proletarian revolutions, a socialist United States of Europe, and maybe even of America. Well, it didn't happen. That requires a whole separate analysis by itself. In fact, Leon Trotsky, who was our teacher at that time, told us that if we did not get what we wanted, and he unfortunately died in 1940, at the very beginning of the war, or virtually at the beginning of the war, then we have to analyze everything. Why is it that capitalism could carry through a war like this? 5 years? German workers fighting right up to Hitler's bunker, defending him? No general strikes that we knew of in Germany? National struggles rather than international struggles? And class struggles? So coming out of that period, I felt personally, and as I felt, I'm sure many of my comrades at that time felt, that we had to make a fundamental reappraisal. We had to completely review all our basic theories.